Welcome to the Albuquerque Journal's Tech Outlook podcast. CNM is truly one college with infinite possibilities in tech and data sciences. CNM offers programs where everyone can learn about software, apps, or how to build websites. You can also choose from AI programs and machine learning, the Internet of Things, and so much more. CNM, one college, infinite possibilities, and the proud sponsor of the Tech Outlook podcasts.
Welcome to Tech Outlook, a podcast from the Albuquerque Journal Business Desk. I'm Megan Gleason, a reporter here at the Albuquerque Journal. Today we're diving into a solution to the nation's aging and strained power grid. And with us to talk about that today is Julia Selker, who's the executive director of WATT. That's the Working for Advanced Transmission Technologies Coalition. It's the only organization working exclusively to tackle economic and policy obstacles through grid-enhancing technologies, or GETs, on the U.S. transmission grid. Julia, thanks so much for being here. Tell us about WATT.
Oh, thanks for having me. Yeah, the WATT Coalition is a group of companies in the grid enhancing technologies space, vendors, also clean energy interests, so renewable energy developers and project finance, and then also utilities. So the Vermont Electric, VELCO. I'm not going to try and get the acronym right. VELCO is a member. They own the transmission system and build the transmission system in Vermont. And then AES Corporation, which has a utility in Indiana and Ohio, are also members. And we formed back in 2017 because there is this set of technologies for the transmission grid that is fully commercialized and deployed around the world. But in the United States, our utility incentive structure and some other institutions really hold back deployment. And there are some policy solutions that we're trying to get in place.
Yeah. How did you get into this kind of work?
Yeah, it's a sort of a funnel, getting more and more specific, but I wanted to impact climate change. I got really interested in electricity policy. And then the transmission grid is at this point really the primary obstacle to renewable energy development in the United States. The backlog of projects that are ready to be built but don't have transmission capacity grows every year. And the existing projects are seeing more and more curtailment, so they can't deliver power because there's not enough transmission capacity. So the transmission grid became my passion, and these technologies are really, really common sense. And the main obstacle we face is just inertia to change. So it's exciting to work on these. It feels like we're poised to make some change, and that keeps me really motivated.
Yeah. I often hear all the time about the issues of the grid and not as often the solutions of the grid. So can you get more into what the issues are and how it's affecting people?
Yeah, so the transmission grid was built a long time ago. A lot of the grid is more than 50 years old. And it was built for generation that was located pretty close to load, so close to cities, for instance. And that was thermal generation based on burning fuels, so coal and natural gas. And now that we're transitioning to clean energy resources, those resources are further away from cities often. So the grid that we have isn't delivering those new resources as we need it to. So we see a lot of benefits from this transition, right? You have less pollution in near cities. You have lower emissions of greenhouse gases, but we do need to build a grid to support the future resource mix.
Mm-hmm. And you're looking into grid enhancing technologies. Can you tell me what exactly that is and how it works?
Yeah, so these are technologies that go on the existing transmission system and get more value and capacity out of the grid we already have, and then also the grid that we'll build. So you can think of them with some traffic metaphors as my favorite way to think about it. So generally, if you're a renewable energy developer and you're looking at the grid, you might basically assume that there's another lane open on the grid that you're not allowed to drive on. You know, there's just a row of bollards is how I visualize it. And what we're trying to do is unlock that extra capacity. So Dynamic line ratings are one tool to do that. Think about the transmission lines, the cables you see in the air. A lot of them have a limit on how much power they can transmit that's based on assumptions, and often pretty conservative and worst case assumptions. So you'll think, okay, what is the hottest wet day going to be this year? And assume we don't have very much wind. Okay, then how much power can we transmit? Because when we transmit power, it heats up the line. So dynamic line ratings are like opening that lane on the line because they actually calculate how much capacity is on that line. And most days you have a lot more capacity, like 10, 20, even 30% more capacity on that line, which can really make a huge difference for renewable energy delivery. And then advanced power flow control is sort of like a traffic director, maybe a traffic light that can push power off of overloaded circuits and onto underloaded circuits, like taking a detour. So you put these devices at the substation and they can redirect the flow of power, which opens up all that extra capacity that was on this other circuit that was underutilized. And then finally, topology optimization software is kind of like a Google Maps for the grid. It helps identify those detours that can be taken. And a lot of them can be created just by flipping switches at the substation that already exists. So you don't even need a fancy power flow controller to do this. And so we'll have a congested line that's like causing renewable energy to be curtailed. And actually, if you turn off a different line in the system, that will redistribute the flow of power because power flows kind of like a river. So it's like you're damming it up somewhere and that changes the flow. So I got lots of metaphors, but those are the three technologies we're most focused on. And like I said, they go on top of existing or in addition to existing facilities. So it costs a lot of money to build a new transmission line. And takes a lot of time to get the siting done and buy the land rights, et cetera. But with these technologies, you don't have any of that delay and they are really low cost. So these technologies cost, 1/5 at the most, but often like 1/200th of a traditional transmission investment. And they pay for themselves often in the space of months. So it's exciting to work on these.
Yeah. Wow. And speaking of cost, can you speak to cost savings that consumers could see with GETs?
Yeah. So there's a few different ways that these technologies save money. One of the easiest ways to calculate cost in regions with electricity markets is called congestion costs. And so that's the difference between the lowest cost generation that's available, usually renewables because there's no fuel cost, versus the generation you had to deploy because there was a transmission constraint blocking the low cost power. So in 2022, across the country, we estimate that those costs were about $20 billion, and GETs can often resolve 40 or more % of congestion costs. So that could have saved, $8 billion in just 1 year. Now, in New Mexico, there isn't a power market, so those costs are not as transparent. But if you enable more capacity on the existing grid, then you get access to lower cost power if you can build new renewable generators. So that's called production cost savings when we model it and calculate it. And in one study in the PJM region, which is like the mid-Atlantic in 5 states, they found that the production cost savings from using GETs to integrate new renewables could be $1 billion a year, within the next 5 years, if I'm remembering the study right. So lower power costs, and then also avoided upgrades. Sometimes you don't need to rebuild a line if you can unlock a lot more capacity with dynamic line rating. So there's a lot of transmission that needs to be built, but we don't have to, we might be able to reduce the amount we have to build by using GETs.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's a lot of positives. Why aren't we seeing this more in the U.S.?
Yeah, so there are 2 main obstacles. The first is inertia, like I mentioned. So the transmission grid has been planned and operated in the same way for almost 100 years. And getting people to think about the grid as a dynamic, flexible asset instead of, a static asset takes time to convince people that this is worthwhile. But we're dealing with the same issue on the generation side, right? We used to just use fuel based generation, and you knew it was always going to be there. Now we have variable renewable generation, and you have to think about generation differently. Well, you also have to think about the grid differently. So inertia is one issue. And then the other is incentives. Investor-owned utilities in the United States make their money based on the amount of money they spend building the grid. So if you ask them to use a really low-cost technology that might have more operational costs, more staff time, more training time, some software costs associated with it, they don't make money on those things. So they have no incentive to deploy these technologies.
Yeah. And that relates to the next question, I would assume, which is what can state and federal governments to encourage more use of GETs? What can they do?
Yeah, so the federal government has a lot going on this topic. The Department of Energy's new motto is deploy, deploy, deploy. And they just released a report called Pathways to Commercial Liftoff Innovative Grid Deployment. So it focuses on GETs and other grid technologies that are available but not being widely deployed, mostly for the reason I mentioned around incentives. So they are working on information. They also have grant programs, so billions of dollars of matching grants where a utility or other entity can propose a project, and the federal government will cover half the cost of that project if it's innovative, improves resilience, and achieves other goals of the program. So the Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnerships Program, GRIP program, is the big opportunity there, and they are opening their final round of funding in the fall. So definitely want utilities to apply there, and there are even more opportunities for nonprofit utilities, so cooperatives and municipal utilities, to get federal support for innovation. Then the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is really in charge of transmission policy in the United States, so they're the best position to act on GETs, and they have in 3 separate orders. One, to update requirements for line ratings. So they're requiring ambient adjusted ratings, which means the ratings are based on temperature. Now, dynamic line ratings sensors also take real data. Ambient adjusted ratings are still based on assumptions. So we're still really pushing for dynamic line ratings, which can also achieve more cost savings. They updated generator interconnection rules to include GETs, and they just on Monday released a new transmission planning rule, or regional long-term transmission planning rule, that will require regions to evaluate GETs to improve the cost effectiveness and increase the value of transmission.
Yeah. Anything we should look out for on a state level?
Yeah, so the states don't have very much jurisdiction over transmission, but they do have jurisdiction over resource planning. So to the extent that a state has a clean energy goal, they can really push the utilities to use all available tools to achieve that resource goal. So encourage states to pursue that through legislation or regulation. There's also the Public Regulatory Commission could open a docket asking the utilities, hey, how are you going after this federal funding? Are you using GETs today? And show us some examples of how you're evaluating them or using GETs. So those moves would kind of help address the inertia question, to really put pressure on the utilities to demonstrate that they're using the best-in-class tools and solving problems for ratepayers at the lowest cost.
Yeah. How interesting. What a huge topic. I'm so glad you came on today to talk about this. I think that wraps us up. So thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you.
For everyone watching, you can find Tech Outlook every Monday afternoon. We're on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and SoundCloud. But until then, I'll see you next time.